The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of the Afghan mountains as Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell adjusted her tactical gear one final time. As the only female officer assigned to SEAL Team 7's current mission, she had grown accustomed to the curious glances and occasional skeptical remarks from some of the local military personnel they worked alongside. But her teammates knew better. Sarah had earned her place through years of grueling training, countless successful operations, and an unwavering dedication that had saved more lives than she cared to count. The mission briefing had been straightforward. Enough. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value terrorist target was hiding in an abandoned mining complex deep in the mountainous region near the Pakistani border. The mines had been operational during the Soviet occupation decades earlier, but were now little more than a maze of tunnels and forgotten shafts that provided perfect cover for anyone looking to disappear from the world above. Team 7 consisted of 8 members, each bringing their own specialized skills to the operation. There was Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rodriguez, a demolitions expert whose steady hands could disarm almost anything with wires and explosives. Petty Officer First Class Jake Thompson served as their communications specialist, his equipment allowing them to stay connected with command even in the most remote locations. The team's medic, Hospital Corpsman Second Class David Chen, carried enough medical supplies to treat everything from minor cuts to life-threatening injuries in the field. Rounding out the team were Petty Officers Mike Sullivan and Tony Reeves, both experienced in close-quarters combat and reconnaissance. Petty Officer James Carter brought his expertise in underwater operations, though they hoped his skills wouldn't be needed in the dry mountain environment. Finally, there was Petty Officer Alex Brooks, their sniper, whose ability to provide overwatch had proven invaluable in previous missions. Sarah had studied the mining complex extensively during their preparation phase. The main entrance led to a central chamber that branched off into multiple tunnel systems. Some led to old mining shafts that dropped hundreds of feet into darkness, while others twisted and turned through the mountain before eventually leading to secondary exits. The intelligence suggested their target was using the deepest sections as a command center, believing the remote location and maze-like structure would protect him from any military action. The helicopter insertion had gone smoothly, with the team touching down several kilometers from the mining complex just before dawn. They had moved carefully through the rugged terrain, using natural cover to avoid detection by any potential lookouts. The area was known to be populated by local sympathizers who might alert their target to the presence of American forces. As they approached the mine entrance, Sarah felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and focused calm that came before every operation. She had learned early in her career that fear was natural, but controlling it and channeling it into heightened awareness was what separated good operators from great ones. The entrance to the mine was partially concealed by decades of rockfall and overgrown vegetation, but their intelligence had been accurate about its location. Chief Rodriguez took point as they prepared to enter the underground complex. His experience in similar environments made him the logical choice to lead them through the initial stages of the infiltration. The team moved in a carefully choreographed formation, each member covering specific angles and maintaining visual contact with their teammates despite the increasing darkness. The air inside the mine was stale and thick with decades of accumulated dust and moisture. Their night vision equipment revealed a tunnel that stretched ahead into blackness, with support beams that looked questionable at best. Water dripped constantly from somewhere in the darkness above, creating an echo that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah positioned herself in the middle of the formation, where she could maintain command and control while still being ready to respond to threats from either direction. Her weapon was ready, safety off, finger resting alongside the trigger guard in the position that had become second nature through thousands of hours of training. The first few hundred meters of the tunnel system seemed stable enough, though they moved carefully to avoid disturbing loose rocks or creating unnecessary noise. Thompson periodically checked his communications equipment, but as expected, their radio contact with the outside world gradually faded as they moved deeper into the mountain. They reached the first major intersection after 20 minutes of careful movement. 3 tunnels branched off from the main passage, each disappearing into darkness. According to their maps, the middle passage led toward the deepest sections of the complex where their target was most likely to be found. The left tunnel appeared to lead to some of the older mining shafts, while the right passage seemed to curve back toward what might be another entrance or exit. Rodriguez signaled for a brief halt while they confirmed their route and checked their equipment. Everything seemed to be proceeding according to plan. Their target remained unaware of their presence, and the tunnel system, while complex, was navigable with their current equipment and expertise. It was Thompson who first noticed something was wrong. His communications equipment, which should have maintained at least some basic functionality even underground, was showing readings that didn't make sense. The electromagnetic interference patterns suggested they were in an environment with unusual metallic properties, possibly indicating the presence of equipment or materials that hadn't been mentioned in their intelligence briefing. Sarah made the decision to continue with the mission while keeping Thompson's observations in mind. They had trained for situations where communications were compromised, and their primary objective remained unchanged. The team moved forward into the middle tunnel, maintaining their careful formation and steady pace. The tunnel began to slope downward more steeply than their maps had indicated, and the air grew noticeably colder as they descended. The sound of dripping water became more pronounced, and occasionally they could hear what might have been voices echoing from somewhere far ahead in the darkness. After another 15 minutes of movement, they reached what appeared to be a large, central chamber. Their night vision revealed a space much larger than anything shown on their maps, with multiple passages leading off in different directions. More concerning was evidence of recent human activity: footprints in the dust, discarded food containers, and what looked like temporary sleeping areas. Sarah realized they were getting close to their objective, but something about the situation felt different from what they had expected. The intelligence had suggested a small group hiding in the deepest parts of the mine, but the evidence they were seeing indicated a much larger operation. She made the decision to proceed with extra caution, knowing that their success and survival might depend on adapting to circumstances that were rapidly proving to be more complex than anyone had anticipated. The central chamber proved to be even more extensive than Sarah had initially realized. As her eyes adjusted to the space beyond what their night vision could reveal clearly, she began to understand that they had stumbled into something far more significant than a simple hiding place. The chamber showed signs of having been used as a major staging area, with evidence of dozens of people having passed through recently. Chief Rodriguez moved carefully around the perimeter of the space, his hand signals indicating that he was finding multiple tunnel entrances they hadn't expected. Some appeared to be original mining passages, while others looked like they had been deliberately excavated or expanded more recently. The implications were troubling. If their intelligence had been wrong about the size and scope of the operation they were investigating, there could be many more hostiles in the area than they had prepared for. Thompson continued to struggle with his communications equipment, but his expertise allowed him to determine that the interference wasn't natural. Someone had deliberately set up jamming equipment in the area, which meant their presence might not be as much of a surprise as they had hoped. The realization that they were potentially walking into a prepared defensive position changed the entire dynamic of their mission. Sarah gathered her team in the center of the chamber for a brief tactical conference. Speaking in whispers that barely carried beyond their immediate circle, she outlined their options. They could continue forward with their original mission, knowing that the situation was more complex than expected. They could attempt to withdraw and call for additional support, though their compromised communications made that difficult. Or they could adapt their approach and gather more intelligence about what they were actually facing before making their next move. The team's experience showed in their quick analysis of the situation. Rodriguez pointed out that if they withdrew, now their target would almost certainly be alerted to their presence and would disappear before any follow-up mission could be organized. Carter noted that the jamming equipment suggested a level of sophistication that hadn't been mentioned in their briefing, which could indicate they were dealing with a much more significant operation than originally believed. Chen, ever practical, reminded them that their medical supplies were calculated for the original mission parameters. If they were facing a larger enemy force, their ability to handle casualties could be severely limited. Brooks, scanning the multiple tunnel entrances with his scope, observed that the chamber's layout would make it difficult to establish good fields of fire if they encountered resistance. Sullivan and Reeves, both experienced in close quarters combat, pointed out that the tunnel system could work to their advantage if they needed to move quickly and avoid large numbers of enemies. The narrow passages would limit how many hostiles could engage them at once, but would also limit their own ability to maneuver and use their superior training and equipment effectively. Thompson's ongoing analysis of the electromagnetic interference patterns revealed something even more concerning. The jamming wasn't just blocking their communications with the outside world. It was also interfering with some of their electronic equipment, including their night vision systems and GPS devices. They were essentially operating blind in an environment that their enemies knew much better than they did. Sarah weighed all of these factors quickly. Her training and experience told her that the smartest tactical decision would be to withdraw and reassess. But her instincts as a leader told her that this might be their only opportunity to gather crucial intelligence about what was, obviously, a much larger operation than anyone had realized. She made the decision to continue forward, but with significant modifications to their original plan. Instead of moving directly toward their primary target, they would conduct a careful reconnaissance of the tunnel system to better understand what they were dealing with. If the situation proved to be manageable, they would continue with their mission. If not, they would gather as much intelligence as possible and then withdraw to plan a larger operation. The team moved into the tunnel system with even greater caution than before. Rodriguez took point again, but now they moved in a more dispersed formation that would allow them to respond more effectively to contact from multiple directions. Sarah positioned herself where she could maintain command and control, while also being ready to make quick tactical decisions based on what they encountered. The tunnel they chose sloped steadily downward and showed clear signs of recent foot traffic. The walls were reinforced with newer timber supports that looked professionally installed, not the kind of improvised work they might expect from a small group of hiding terrorists. Water continued to drip from above, but now they could also hear what sounded like generators running somewhere in the distance. After several minutes of careful movement, they reached another intersection, this one with 5 different passages, leading off in various directions. The complexity of the tunnel system was becoming apparent, and Sarah realized that their maps were essentially useless. They were navigating a maze that had been significantly modified from its original mining configuration. It was Brooks who first spotted the surveillance camera. Mounted high on the wall at the intersection, it was positioned to monitor anyone moving through the area. The camera appeared to be functional, with a small red light indicating it was recording. The implications were immediate and serious. Their presence was no longer a secret, and whoever was operating the surveillance system now knew exactly where they were, and probably how many of them there were. Sarah had to make another critical decision quickly. They could attempt to disable the camera, but that would definitely alert their enemies that someone was in the tunnels. They could try to move past it quickly and hope that whoever was monitoring hadn't been paying attention at that moment. Or they could assume their cover was blown and prepare for immediate contact with enemy forces. Thompson, working frantically with his equipment, managed to determine that the surveillance system was operating on a frequency that suggested it was part of a much larger network. There were probably multiple cameras throughout the tunnel system, all feeding back to a central monitoring location. Disabling one camera wouldn't significantly improve their situation. The sound of the generators was getting louder as they moved deeper into the tunnel system, and they began to encounter electrical cables running along the walls and ceiling. Someone had invested significant time and resources into making the underground complex fully functional. This wasn't a temporary hiding place. It was a permanent installation that had been designed for long-term occupation. Chen noticed that the air quality was improving as they moved deeper, suggesting that there was some kind of ventilation system operating. The combination of surveillance cameras, electrical power, ventilation, and reinforced tunnels painted a picture of an operation that was far more sophisticated and well-funded than their intelligence had indicated. Sarah realized that they had stumbled into something that could be of enormous strategic importance. If they could gather detailed intelligence about the facility and its occupants, It could lead to a much larger operation that might disrupt a significant terrorist network. But first, they had to survive long enough to get that information back to their commanders. The team continued forward, knowing that they were probably being watched, but hoping that their enemies might wait to see what they were doing before taking action. Every step took them deeper into a situation that was rapidly becoming more dangerous and unpredictable than anything they had trained for. The tunnel system continued to reveal its secrets as Team 7 moved deeper into the mountain. What had started as a simple infiltration mission was rapidly becoming a complex intelligence-gathering operation in an environment that seemed designed to trap unwary intruders. Sarah found herself constantly recalculating their situation as each new discovery changed her understanding of what they were facing. The electrical cables they had been following led to what appeared to be a major junction box mounted on the tunnel wall. Rodriguez examined it carefully and determined that it was distributing power to multiple sections of the complex. The sophistication of the electrical work suggested that whoever had installed it had significant technical expertise and access to quality materials. This wasn't the kind of improvised setup they might expect from a typical terrorist cell. Thompson's equipment was picking up radio transmissions coming from somewhere deeper in the complex. The signals were encrypted, but their pattern and frequency suggested military-grade communications equipment. He was able to determine that there were at least 3 different radio networks operating in the facility, which implied a level of organization and security that went far beyond what their original intelligence had suggested. As they continued forward, the tunnel began to level out and they started encountering side passages that had been blocked off with professional-looking barriers. Some appeared to be permanent installations, while others looked like they could be quickly removed, if necessary. Sarah realized that the tunnel system had been deliberately modified to create a defensive network that could be used to control access to different areas of the complex. The sound of machinery was getting louder, and they could now identify what sounded like multiple generators running at different speeds. There was also a rhythmic sound that might have been ventilation fans or possibly some kind of manufacturing equipment. Whatever was happening in the deepest parts of the complex required significant electrical power and infrastructure. Brooks, who had been monitoring their rear security, reported that he could hear voices echoing from somewhere behind them. The sounds were too distant and distorted to make out specific words, but it was clear that there were people moving through the tunnel system. Sarah had to assume that their presence had been detected and that hostile forces were beginning to respond. She gathered her team at what appeared to be a relatively secure position where the tunnel widened slightly and offered some cover from both directions. Their situation was becoming increasingly precarious. They were deep underground in an unknown facility. Their communications were compromised. They were probably under surveillance, and there were indications that hostile forces were beginning to move against them. The original mission parameters called for them to identify and eliminate a high-value target, but it was becoming clear that they had stumbled into something much more significant. Sarah had to decide whether to continue forward in an attempt to gather more intelligence or to begin planning their withdrawal before they became completely trapped in the underground complex. Chen had been monitoring their physical condition and reminded Sarah that they had been moving through the tunnels for over an hour. Their oxygen levels were still adequate thanks to the ventilation system, but prolonged physical exertion in the underground environment was beginning to take its toll. More importantly, their ammunition and other supplies were calculated for a much shorter operation. Rodriguez reported that he had been observing the tunnel construction and believed that much of it was relatively recent. The newer sections showed signs of having been excavated with modern equipment, and the support structures were professionally installed. Someone had invested months or possibly years of work into creating the complex they were now exploring. Thompson managed to intercept part of a radio transmission that included what sounded like coordinate references. While he couldn't decrypt the full message, the format suggested that whoever was operating the communications network had detailed maps of the tunnel system and was probably coordinating the movement of personnel throughout the complex. The implications were becoming unavoidable. They weren't dealing with a small group of terrorists hiding in an abandoned mine. They had discovered what appeared to be a major command and control facility that had been constructed specifically to support large-scale operations. The intelligence value of what they had already observed was enormous, but they needed to survive long enough to report their findings. Sarah made the decision to continue forward for a limited time, while gathering as much intelligence as possible. If they could determine the full scope of the facility and identify its key personnel, the information could be used to plan a much larger operation that might deal a significant blow to terrorist activities in the region. The team resumed their movement with even greater caution. Every step forward took them deeper into potential danger, but also potentially closer to intelligence that could save lives and disrupt enemy operations. The tunnel continued to slope downward, and they began to encounter more sophisticated security measures. Motion sensors had been installed at regular intervals, though Thompson believed they might be inactive based on the electromagnetic signatures he was detecting. There were also what appeared to be hardened defensive positions that could be quickly manned if the facility came under attack. Someone had put considerable thought into defending the underground complex against military action. The sound of machinery was now loud enough that they could distinguish between different types of equipment. There were definitely multiple generators running, but there was also what sounded like ventilation systems, possibly some kind of manufacturing equipment, and what might have been computer servers or communications gear. Carter, who had been studying the tunnel construction, pointed out that the newer sections showed evidence of having been designed for specific purposes. Some areas had been excavated to accommodate large equipment, while others seemed designed for personnel movement and storage. The complex had been planned and built with specific operational requirements in mind. As they approached what appeared to be another major intersection, Brooks spotted additional surveillance cameras positioned to monitor the area from multiple angles. The surveillance network was clearly extensive, and Sarah had to assume that their every movement was being observed and recorded. The question was whether their enemies were waiting for them to move deeper into the complex before taking action, or whether they were planning something else. The voices they had been hearing from behind them were getting closer, and Thompson was now picking up radio transmissions that seemed to be coordinating some kind of response to their presence. Time was running out for them to gather intelligence and plan their next move. Sarah realized that they were approaching a critical decision point. They could continue forward and risk becoming trapped in the complex, or they could begin their withdrawal and risk losing the opportunity to gather intelligence about what was clearly a major enemy facility. Either choice carried significant risks, but the potential consequences of their decision would extend far beyond their immediate survival. The intersection ahead proved to be the entrance to what could only be described as an underground command center. As Team 7 approached carefully, they could see that the tunnel opened into a large chamber that had been extensively modified and equipped with sophisticated technology. Banks of monitors lined the walls, and the steady hum of computer equipment filled the air, along with the sound of the generators they had been hearing. Sarah signaled for the team to take defensive positions while she assessed the situation. From their vantage point at the tunnel entrance, they could see at least a dozen people working at various stations throughout the chamber. Most appeared to be focused on their tasks and unaware of the SEAL team's presence, but Sarah noticed that several individuals were wearing what looked like military-style equipment and appeared to be providing security for the operation. The sophistication of the facility was immediately apparent. Multiple large screens displayed what appeared to be maps, satellite imagery, and various data streams. Communications equipment that looked military-grade was positioned throughout the chamber, and there were several workstations that seemed to be dedicated to coordinating complex operations. This wasn't just a hiding place for terrorists. It was a fully functional command and control center for what appeared to be a major network. Rodriguez had positioned himself where he could observe the chamber's entrances and exits. He counted at least 4 other tunnels leading away from the Yao main chamber, plus what appeared to be a stairway leading to an upper level. The defensive possibilities were both good and bad. The multiple exits meant they wouldn't be easily trapped, but they also meant that enemy reinforcements could arrive from several directions. Thompson was having more success with his communications equipment now that they were closer to the source of the jamming. He was able to determine that the facility was running multiple sophisticated electronic warfare systems, designed not just to block outside communications, but also to intercept and analyze military radio traffic from a wide area. The implications for regional security were staggering. As they watched the activity in the chamber, Sarah began to understand the true scope of what they had discovered. This wasn't just a local operation. It was clearly part of a much larger network that was capable of coordinating activities across a wide area. The intelligence value of what they were observing was enormous, but getting that information back to their commanders was becoming increasingly challenging. Chen had been monitoring the air quality and reported that while the ventilation system was keeping oxygen levels adequate, there were traces of chemicals in the air that suggested some kind of manufacturing or laboratory work was being conducted elsewhere in the complex. The possibility that they were dealing with weapons production added another layer of urgency to their situation. Brooks, maintaining overwatch on their rear position, reported that the voices they had been hearing were definitely getting closer. He estimated that there were at least 6 to 8 individuals moving through the tunnel system behind them, and their movement patterns suggested they were conducting a systematic search. Time was running out for Team 7 to complete their reconnaissance and begin their withdrawal. Sarah made the decision to gather as much intelligence as possible about the command center while preparing for immediate contact with enemy forces. She positioned her team to cover the chamber while also maintaining escape routes through the various tunnels. If they were discovered, they would need to fight their way out while protecting the critical intelligence they had gathered. Sullivan and Reeves moved to positions where they could observe the personnel in the command center and identify potential high-value targets. Both reported seeing individuals who appeared to be senior leaders based on their behavior and the deference shown to them by others in the chamber. If the opportunity presented itself, eliminating these individuals could significantly disrupt the network's operations. The activity in the command center suddenly increased as several individuals gathered around one of the large displays. Sarah could see that they were looking at what appeared to be a detailed map of the local area, with various symbols and markings that suggested they were tracking multiple operations simultaneously. The scale and complexity of their activities was far beyond what anyone had imagined when planning the original mission. Thompson managed to intercept several radio transmissions that, while still encrypted, provided valuable information about the network structure and capabilities. The call signs and communication patterns suggested a hierarchical organization with multiple cells operating throughout the region. The command center was clearly serving as a coordination hub for a much larger operation. As they continued their observation, Sarah noticed that one of the individuals in the command center was a woman who appeared to be in a position of significant authority. She was directing activities at multiple workstations and seemed to be making important decisions about ongoing operations. Sarah realized that this individual might be an even more valuable target than the person they had originally been sent to find. The sound of approaching footsteps in the tunnel behind them was getting louder, and Brooks reported that he could now see lights moving in their direction. The search party that had been following them was getting close, and Team 7 would soon be forced to make a decisive move. They could attempt to remain hidden and hope the search party would pass by, or they could prepare for immediate combat. Rodriguez had been studying the chamber's layout and reported that there were several pieces of equipment that looked like they might be critical to the facility's operations. If they could destroy or disable key systems, they might be able to significantly disrupt the network's activities, even if they couldn't capture or eliminate all of the personnel. The situation was rapidly approaching a critical point. Sarah had to decide whether to attempt to gather more intelligence, initiate combat operations against the command center, or begin their immediate withdrawal before they became completely surrounded. Each option carried significant risks, but the potential impact of their decision could affect regional security for months or years to come. Carter had been studying the tunnel system and believed he had identified a route that might allow them to reach one of the facility's other exits. However, the path would require them to move through areas where they might encounter additional enemy personnel, and they would be completely cut off from their original extraction route. The woman in the command center suddenly looked directly toward the tunnel entrance where Team 7 was positioned. Sarah wasn't sure if they had been spotted, but the woman's behavior suggested that she was aware something was wrong. She began issuing what appeared to be urgent instructions to the security personnel in the chamber. Sarah realized that their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Within minutes, they would either need to take action or risk being trapped in the underground complex. The intelligence they had gathered was invaluable, but it would be worthless if they couldn't survive to report it. The most critical decision of the mission was about to be made, and the consequences would determine not only their survival, but potentially the success of future operations against a network that was far more dangerous and sophisticated than anyone had realized. The moment of decision arrived when the woman in the command center pointed directly at their position and shouted something in a language Sarah didn't recognize. Immediately, the entire chamber erupted into activity as personnel scrambled to defensive positions and security teams began moving toward the tunnel entrances. There was no longer any question about whether their presence had been detected. Sarah had perhaps 30 seconds to make a decision that would determine the outcome of the mission and potentially the survival of her entire team. She could order an immediate assault on the command center, hoping to eliminate key personnel and destroy critical equipment before enemy reinforcements arrived. She could order an immediate withdrawal, accepting that they would lose the opportunity to disrupt the network's operations, but potentially saving her team's lives. Or she could attempt a fighting withdrawal that would allow them to gather more intelligence while moving toward an escape route. The sound of automatic weapons being prepared echoed through the chamber as the security personnel took positions behind computer equipment and makeshift barriers. Sarah could see at least 8 armed individuals in the command center, with more arriving through the other tunnel entrances. The tactical situation was rapidly becoming untenable for a team of 8, against what appeared to be dozens of defenders who knew the terrain better than they did. Rodriguez had identified several pieces of equipment that appeared to be critical to the facility's communications and coordination capabilities. If they could destroy those systems, they might be able to significantly disrupt the network's operations, even if they couldn't eliminate all of the personnel. However, reaching those targets would require them to advance into the chamber under fire from multiple directions. Thompson reported that he was detecting increased radio traffic throughout the facility, indicating that reinforcements were being called in from other parts of the complex. The search party that had been following them was now close enough that they could hear individual voices, and there were indications that additional groups were moving to block their potential escape routes. The woman who appeared to be in command of the facility was now speaking rapidly into a radio, while pointing at various displays and issuing what were clearly tactical instructions. Sarah realized that they were facing an experienced military commander who was coordinating a sophisticated response to their presence. This wasn't going to be a simple firefight. It was going to be a battle against an organized force that had prepared for exactly this type of situation. Brooks reported movement in the tunnel behind them and estimated that the pursuing force would reach their position within minutes. Team 7 was about to be caught between defenders in the command center and attackers approaching from their rear. The tactical situation was rapidly becoming impossible, but Sarah knew that retreating without taking any action would mean losing the intelligence opportunity of a lifetime. She made the decision that would define the rest of the mission. Rather than attempting a full assault or an immediate retreat, she would initiate a limited engagement designed to gather as much intelligence as possible while preparing for a fighting withdrawal. The plan was risky, but it offered the best chance of both surviving the encounter and accomplishing their broader strategic objectives. Sarah positioned Rodriguez and Sullivan to provide covering fire while she and Carter moved to get a better view of the command center's layout and operations. Thompson would continue monitoring communications and electronic warfare systems while preparing to document everything they observed. Chen would prepare to treat casualties while also serving as a backup for any team member who was incapacitated. Brooks and Reeves would cover their rear and flanks while looking for alternative escape routes. The engagement began when one of the security personnel in the command center opened fire at their position. The shots went wide, but they marked the beginning of what Sarah knew would be an intense firefight in close quarters. Rodriguez returned fire immediately, his shots forcing the defenders to take better cover and disrupting their ability to coordinate their response. As the firefight developed, Sarah was able to observe more of the command center's operations. She could see that the facility was coordinating activities in multiple countries, with operations that appeared to include weapons trafficking, intelligence gathering, and what might have been planning for major terrorist attacks. The scope and sophistication of the network was far beyond anything that had been previously identified. The woman in command was still directing operations despite the ongoing firefight, and Sarah realized that eliminating her might be the single most effective action they could take. However, the commander had positioned herself behind heavy equipment that provided excellent cover, and reaching her would require exposing team members to significant risk. Carter had moved to a position where he could observe one of the other tunnel entrances and reported that additional security personnel were arriving from deeper in the complex. The defenders now outnumbered Team 7 by at least 3-1, and the tactical situation was continuing to deteriorate. However, the narrow confines of the tunnel system were limiting how many enemies could engage them simultaneously. Thompson had managed to access some of the facility's computer systems during the confusion of the firefight and was downloading intelligence that could prove invaluable to future operations. However, his activities had been noticed by the facility's technical personnel, who were now attempting to shut down their systems and prevent further intelligence gathering. The pursuing force from behind finally reached their position, and Brooks engaged them with precision fire that stopped their advance, but also revealed Team 7's rear position. They were now taking fire from two directions, and Sarah realized that they had only minutes before their position became completely untenable. Rodriguez had succeeded in damaging several pieces of critical equipment with carefully placed shots, and smoke was beginning to fill parts of the command center as electronic systems failed. The facility's personnel were clearly struggling to maintain their operations while dealing with the ongoing firefight, but they continued to fight with determination that suggested they understood the importance of protecting their installation. Chen reported that Sullivan had taken a minor wound from ricocheting fragments but was still combat effective. However, their ammunition expenditure was higher than planned, and they would need to conserve their remaining supplies for what promised to be a challenging withdrawal from the underground complex. The woman commander suddenly appeared at a position where Sarah had a clear shot. For a moment, time seemed suspended as Sarah weighed the tactical value of eliminating what was clearly a high-value target against the risk of exposing herself to return fire. The decision she made in that instant would determine whether they had achieved their primary objective, but it would also commit them to a course of action that would make their escape even more challenging. Sarah took the shot, knowing that everything that followed would depend on the skills, training, and teamwork that had brought them this far into an impossible situation. Sarah's shot found its target, and the woman commander fell behind the equipment she had been using for cover. The immediate effect on the facility's defenders was dramatic. Without their leader's coordination, their return fire became less organized, and their tactical responses more hesitant. However, Sarah knew that eliminating one person, no matter how important, wouldn't stop the dozens of other personnel who were still fighting to protect their installation. The success of the shot also seemed to galvanize the remaining defenders. What had been a somewhat disorganized response suddenly became much more aggressive as security personnel throughout the command center began advancing toward Team 7's position. Sarah realized that while they had achieved a significant tactical success, they had also made their situation considerably more dangerous. Rodriguez continued to target critical equipment while providing covering fire for the rest of the team. His demolitions expertise allowed him to identify which systems were most important to the facility's operations, and his accurate fire was causing significant disruption to their communications and coordination capabilities. Smoke and sparks from damaged electronics were beginning to fill the chamber, providing some concealment but also creating new hazards. Thompson had managed to download significant amounts of intelligence data before the facility's technical personnel could shut down their systems. The information he had gathered included detailed organizational charts, operational plans, and communication protocols that would be invaluable to future counterterrorism operations. However, his success had also made him a priority target for the facility's defenders. The tactical situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Brooks reported that the pursuing force from behind had been reinforced and was preparing for another assault on their position. Carter had identified what appeared to be an alternative escape route through one of the side tunnels, but reaching it would require them to cross an area that was exposed to fire from multiple directions. Chen was treating Sullivan's wound while also preparing medical supplies for what he anticipated would be additional casualties as they fought their way out of the complex. The confined space and intense firefight meant that even minor wounds could become serious problems if they interfered with the team's ability to move quickly through the tunnel system. Sarah made the decision to begin their withdrawal, while they still had the initiative and before enemy reinforcements could completely surround their position. She ordered Rodriguez to place explosive charges on the remaining critical equipment, while the rest of the team prepared to move toward the escape route Carter had identified. The withdrawal began under intense fire as Team 7 moved in a coordinated pattern that had been drilled into them through countless training exercises. Rodriguez's charges detonated just as they cleared the command center, sending a shock wave through the tunnels and causing significant damage to the facility's remaining operational capabilities. The explosion also brought down part of the tunnel ceiling, creating a temporary barrier between them and some of their pursuers. However, the explosion also triggered what appeared to be an automated security system throughout the complex. Brilliancy, lights began flashing, alarms started sounding, and Sarah could hear the sound of blast doors closing in various parts of the tunnel system. The facility had been designed to contain intruders, and they were now racing against time to reach an exit before they became permanently trapped underground. Carter led them through a series of narrow passages that showed signs of recent excavation. The route was more difficult to navigate than their original path, but it also seemed to be less heavily defended. Thompson reported that the explosion had disrupted many of the facility's communication systems, which was making it harder for the defenders to coordinate their response to Team 7's movement. The tunnel system continued to reveal its complexity as they moved toward what they hoped would be an exit. They encountered several more surveillance cameras, but Rodriguez was able to disable them with well-placed shots before they could provide intelligence about the team's location and direction of movement. However, each delay increased the risk that they would be overtaken by their pursuers. Brooks, covering their rear, reported that the explosion had temporarily stopped the force that had been following them, but he could see lights and hear voices, indicating that they were regrouping and would soon resume their pursuit. The blast doors that had closed were apparently designed to compartmentalize the facility rather than completely seal it, because their enemies were finding ways to continue following them through alternative routes. As they moved through the tunnel system, Sarah reflected on what they had accomplished and what it would mean for future operations. They had discovered and partially disrupted a major terrorist command and control facility. They had eliminated what appeared to be a senior leader and gathered intelligence that could lead to the identification and destruction of an entire network. However, their survival was still far from guaranteed. The tunnel Carter was following began to slope upward, which Sarah hoped meant they were approaching ground level and a potential exit. However, the improved air quality and natural lighting also suggested that they were moving toward an area where they might encounter additional defenders who had been positioned to prevent exactly this type of escape. Chen reported that Sullivan's wound was stable, but that the team's overall physical condition was beginning to deteriorate from the stress of prolonged combat in the underground environment. Their water supplies were running low, and the physical demands of moving quickly through difficult terrain while carrying full equipment loads were taking their toll. Thompson had been analyzing the intelligence data he had downloaded and reported that it included information about planned attacks on civilian targets in multiple countries. The urgency of getting the intelligence back to their commanders was enormous, as it might allow them to prevent terrorist attacks that could kill hundreds or thousands of innocent people. The tunnel finally opened into what appeared to be a natural cave system that connected to the surface through a series of passages that had been partially concealed from aerial observation. Sarah could see daylight filtering down from above, and she felt the first real hope she had experienced since they had entered the underground complex hours earlier. However, their relief was short-lived. As they approached the cave entrance, they could see that it was being watched by several armed individuals who had positioned themselves to cover the exit. The facility's security personnel had anticipated that intruders might attempt to escape through the alternative exits and had positioned forces accordingly. Sarah realized that they were facing their final challenge. They had successfully infiltrated the facility, gathered critical intelligence, eliminated a high-value target, and fought their way through a complex underground maze. Now they had to overcome one last defensive position to reach safety and ensure that their intelligence could be used to prevent future terrorist attacks. She gathered her team for what might be their final tactical conference. They had limited ammunition remaining, at least one wounded team member, and they were facing an unknown number of defenders who had prepared positions and knew the terrain. However, they also had the advantage of surprise, superior training, and the desperate motivation of people who knew that failure meant not only their own deaths, but potentially the deaths of many innocent civilians. The final phase of their mission was about to begin, and everything they had trained for, everything they had sacrificed, and everything they believed in would be tested in the next few minutes. Sarah looked at each member of her team and saw the same determination and professionalism that had brought them this far. They had started the day as a SEAL team on a routine mission. They were ending it as the only people who stood between a sophisticated terrorist network and the innocent civilians it was planning to attack. The outcome of the next few minutes would determine whether their sacrifice and courage had been enough to make a difference in a war that was fought in shadows and tunnels, where victory was measured not in territory captured, but in lives saved and attacks prevented. Sarah took a deep breath, checked her weapon one final time, and prepared to lead her team through their last obstacle to safety and success.